Well, good morning. This is Barry Odell with the Church of Christ at Mammoth Spring Facebook page. Hope everybody's doing well today. It is Wednesday, March 10th, 2021, and we are working our way through the book of Daniel. Good morning, Lyle. Good morning, Brian. Hope everybody's doing well out there, and hope you're ready to study. We are ready, hey Connie, we are ready for Daniel chapter 8 today, and so I posted something. Good morning, Diana. Posted something yesterday about this chapter in the We Talk Truth group, and I'm one of the moderators of that group. Daniel chapter 8, among other chapters, but this one in particular, is just an amazing supporter, an amazing evidence or proof of the inspiration of the Scriptures, because of the prophetic specificity of the events that we're going to read about. So pretty interesting chapter, a lot to learn here, and so we're going to go ahead and get started. It's interesting when you study the book of Daniel how often each chapter dates itself with either a specific king or specific dream or event. Of course, the first four chapters chronologically we're dealing with Nebuchadnezzar. I've already talked about this, but then you have to jump chronologically to chapters 7 and 8, which is where we are today. And again, they date themselves. In the first year of Belshazzar, chapter 7, verse 1. In the third year of Belshazzar, chapter 8 and verse 1. And then you jump to chapter 5 because that records Belshazzar's death and the transition of kingdoms from Babylon to the Medes and the Persians. And so we've covered all of that. I just want to go ahead and get into Daniel chapter 8 today, where Daniel sees a vision of a ram and a goat. And just pull a couple things up here. This is Daniel's second vision. And we've already talked about one, obviously, since this is the second one. Chapter 8, verses 1 through 14 deal with this vision, or rather it reveals what the vision was. And the way I'm going to handle this today, we're not going to read all of all of verses 1 through 14, because the vision is in the explanation that's later in the chapter. Hey, Barry and Glenda and Linda, good to see you guys joining on today. So looking at chapter 8, verse 1, in the third year of the reign of King Belshazzar, a vision appeared to me, Daniel, after the one that appeared to me the first time. I saw in the vision, and it so happened while I was looking, that I was in Shushan the citadel, which is in the province of Elam, and I saw in the vision that I was by the river Ulai. Then I lifted my eyes and saw there, standing beside the river, was a ram which had 2 horns, and the 2 horns were high, but one was set higher than the other, and the higher one came up last. I saw the ram pushing westward, northward, southward, so that no animal could withstand him, nor was there any that could deliver from his hand, but he did according to his will, and he became great. Good morning, Donnell. So this is quite an interesting vision, to say the least. But then it changes. While he was considering this ram that was pushing his way around with 2 horns, suddenly a male goat from the west came across the surface of the ground. Without touching the surface of the ground. And the goat had a notable horn between his eyes. So the ram of verses 3 and 4 has to mean something. And then this great male goat, beginning in verse 5, has to mean something. And once again, it's a rather spectacular vision, which this is the nature of much of the book of Daniel and these visions, what we call apocalyptic literature. It's language that is used to show some amazing events, whether it be socio-political events, religious, if you will, events like the establishment of God's kingdom, Daniel chapter 2, verses 44 and 45, Daniel chapter 7, verses 13 and 14, things like this. Just really attention-getting language is used here. And so this ram, again, verses 3 and 4, is pushing his way around the earth, but then this male goat comes along and he takes over. I shared some things on this page, the public Church of Christ at Mammoth Spring Facebook page yesterday. I shared, I think, 3 or 4 articles that will really help you understand Daniel chapters 7 and 8. And I would encourage you, if you're doing this study with me, to look at those. They helped me, and I know they will help you. And so what I want to do is I've kind of introduced you to the vision. I think what we need to do next is just keep reading a little bit here. This ram that we're reading about beginning in verse 5 has 2 horns. Verse 6, the male goat is confronting the ram. He's moved with rage. We know that we're learning something here, obviously, and something of great importance that affects a lot of different people. Well, this goat that has come along, beginning in verse 5, became very strong. So I tell you what, let's just do this. Let's go to the interpretation. All right, because that's the main point here. We're given the vision that Daniel saw, but then when you start reading here in verse 15, Daniel is communicated to, this dream is interpreted to him by Gabriel. So let's look at Daniel chapter 8 and verse 15, and we'll just get down to the nuts and bolts here, as we say. Then it happened, when I, Daniel, had seen the vision and was seeking the meaning, that suddenly there stood before me one having the appearance of a man. So what that tells me in verse 15, Daniel had this vision and he didn't know what it meant. He was seeking the meaning, as verse 15 says. So he heard a man's voice from between the banks of the Ulai, who called and said, Gabriel, make this man understand the vision. That statement right there in Daniel 8:16 helps me appreciate even more Hebrews chapter 1 and verse 1. God, who at various times and in various ways spoke in times past to the fathers by the prophets. This is a prime example of what Hebrews chapter 1 and verse 1 means. God used throughout the years a variety of manners, a variety of ways to communicate to people. Visions like this was one method. Dreams was a method. Dreams were a method. Direct communication with the Lord. Just for instance, Exodus chapter 3 in the burning bush with Moses. Okay? So this is a prime example of that. Daniel doesn't understand the dream, but Gabriel is sent. So verse 17, so he came near where I stood, and when he came, I was afraid and fell on my face. But he said to me, understand, son of man, that the vision refers to the time of the end. The time of the end. The question is, the time of the end of what? What is this goat and this ram and the horns? Well, luckily and thankfully, I shouldn't say luckily, thankfully we have the interpretation here given by an angel of God. So let's look at it. Beginning here in verse 18. Now as he was speaking with me, I was in a deep sleep with my face to the ground, but he touched me and stood me upright, and he said, look, I am making known to you what shall happen in the latter time of the indignation, for the appointed time, at the appointed time the end shall be. So here's what it means. Now, typically, when we're reading the Bible and we read something like the time of the end or the end of time or something like that, we think of the end of the world. Okay, we think of the return of Christ and the destruction of the world and things like this. So we have this language here. For at the appointed time the end shall be, verse 19. Here's what it means. The ram which you saw having 2 horns, they are the kings of Media and Persia. Okay, now we understand part of that dream. See, Daniel is not looking off into our future here. He's not looking into some future antichrist which is going to push people around, or some crazy interpretations that people come up with out of the book of Daniel. He's talking to Daniel about events that are, yes, they're far off in the future, but they're not in our future. We need to understand that. These are the kings of Media and Persia. And the male goat is the kingdom of Greece. There you go. Now things start coming together. The large horn that is between its eyes is the first king. The first king of the kingdom of Greece, following the Medo-Persian Empire, was Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great lived from 356 to 323 BC. Relatively young man when he died. He died at the age of 32 or 33 years old. We know what this dream now is talking about. It's not talking about a future event in our lifetime. So the large horn that is between his eyes is the first king of the kingdom of Greece. As for the broken horn and the four that stood up in its place, 4 kingdoms shall arise out of that nation. What nation? The kingdom of Greece. That follows, that Alexander the Great was king of, the first king of. What we learn is when he died in 323 BC, he reigned for a relatively short period of time, but when he died, his kingdom was divided up among his 4 generals. And I talked about this a little bit yesterday, but it's important because Daniel talks about it so specifically here. The 4 kingdoms, or the 4 generals among whom it was divided, were Lysimachus, Cassander, Ptolemy, and Seleucus. And those names are going to come into play in Daniel chapter 11, incidentally, because we have another vision. But let's continue here in Daniel chapter 8. The broken horn, verse 22, and the 4 that stood up in its place, 4 kingdoms shall arise out of that nation. The Grecian Empire would be divided up after the death of Alexander the Great, the first king. In the latter time of their kingdom, again, follow the pronouns. We're talking about the kingdom of Greece in verse 21. In the latter time of their kingdom, when the transgressors have reached their fullness, a king shall arise having fierce features who understands sinister kings. This is a later period in the empire of Greece, what we're dealing with here. His power shall be mighty, but not by his own power. Remember what we were told in Daniel chapter 4? When Nebuchadnezzar learned some things the hard way? The Most High rules in the kingdoms of men. This is a prominent theme throughout the book of Daniel. His power shall be mighty, but not by his own power. He shall destroy fearfully and shall prosper and thrive. He shall destroy the mighty and also the holy people. So what he sees here, what Daniel's vision includes here, is persecution for the Jewish nation. And I shared some things with you. I'll talk about them here in just a minute. Through his cunning he shall cause deceit to prosper under his rule. He shall exalt himself in his heart. He shall destroy many in their prosperity. He shall even rise against the prince of princes, but he shall be broken without human means. And the vision of the evenings and the mornings, which was told, is true. Therefore seal up the vision, for it refers to many days in the future. The many days that he's talking about is back in Daniel chapter 8 in verse 14. 2,300 days, then the sanctuary shall be cleansed. Again, this future, this event that Daniel has envisioned here is not future for us. It's past for us. This is talking about the Medes and the Persians. This is talking about the Greeks, Alexander the Great, and again, those generals among whom his empire was divided after his death in 323. So when you're looking at all of these things here, beginning in verse 23 of Daniel chapter 8, the later part of their kingdom, there are quite a few kings as you read some history about the Grecian Empire, the Greeks. Of course, starting out with Alexander the Great, a very powerful kingdom, and he was very, as the king, was very powerful himself, very ambitious, if you want to say. But all of these events that are being prophesied here at the end of Daniel chapter 8 are speaking very specifically of the Grecian Empire. Well, who does it then apply to? That's the question that naturally comes to mind. If Alexander the Great lived from 356 to 323, and he reigned for a relatively short amount of time, but he accomplished a lot in his time, who are we dealing with here? Someone who would come later. It's interesting, particularly when you notice the details of this prophecy. Look again at Daniel 8 and verse 24. His power shall be mighty, but not by his own power. He shall destroy fearfully and shall prosper and thrive. He shall destroy the mighty and also the holy people. So whoever this guy is in the future for Daniel, and the holy people, he's going to persecute them. It's interesting. This is one of those passages of the Bible. I think it's kind of like, Peter in 2 Peter chapter 3 spoke of some of Paul's writings. He says some of them are hard to be understood. If we don't dig into some secular history, you would never figure this out. But the fact of the matter is, when you dig into secular history, writers are pretty much unanimous on who exactly this is talking about, a king who would rise up in the latter part of the Grecian Empire and, as it says again in verse 24, destroy the mighty and also the holy people. Do a little research. Again, going back on our public page here, I shared, I think, 3 or 4 articles. Read those articles, and it'll help you out. But who we're dealing with here, again, by pretty much unanimous common thought among everybody who writes about this, is a man by the name of Antiochus IV. Antiochus, just looking at my notes here in the margin of my Bible, Antiochus IV lived from 216 to 164 BC, leader of Greece, the Grecian Empire. This man, he believed he was the son of Zeus. And I've told you this a couple times throughout our study of Daniel, that these polytheistic kings, nations, these kings and leaders oftentimes felt themselves to be the either a god themselves or a descendant of the gods, a descendant of deity. And so Antiochus IV actually named himself Antiochus Epiphanes. Epiphanies, manifestation. He believed that he was the manifestation of God himself. Again, he thought he was the son of Zeus. And some of the things that he did to the Jewish people, which again we'll read about more specifically in Daniel chapter 11, were just horrific, absolutely horrific. Now, Daniel is told here, and again, when you look at chapter 8 and verse 26, the vision that he saw, it says, refers to many days in the future. Looking in Daniel chapter 8 and verse 1, we're in the 3rd year of the reign of King Belshazzar. So we're looking about 530 BC. Well, Antiochus Epiphanes doesn't come on the scene for 300 years. Daniel is seeing a vision of something that's going to happen in approximately 300 years, or perhaps a little bit more. If you do a more specific dating, it would be about 340 to 350 years. That's a long time off in the future. But Daniel, by the visions given him by God, was able to see this, and he was troubled, obviously, by what he saw. Because the holy people, the Jewish people, were going to be affected by what this man, again, Antiochus IV, was going to do. How he destroyed their temple, how he defiled their altar. One of the things he did when he came against Jerusalem and destroyed it was he tore down their altar and built an altar for Zeus in its place. So this is what we're dealing with here, with this kind of man who thought he was a son of the gods. But history, again, tells us who this was, very specifically, and some of the things that he did. When you look at here at Daniel chapter 8 and verse 25, this is interesting too, because this is revealed to Daniel in the vision. It says, he shall be broken without human means. A lot of these guys were either taken out by political means, they were assassinated, or they were killed in battle or something like that. Antiochus Epiphanes died of various diseases that he had contracted throughout the years. And we're not going to go into the ways as to how he came in contact with those diseases, but died apparently a pretty excruciating death, contracting certain diseases and dying from them. In other words, nobody came in and assassinated him to usurp his throne. That's what we're looking at there at the end of verse 25. He was broken without, as the New King James here, human means. It wasn't a revolt or something like that. But when Daniel sees this vision, so Diana asks, so that was the reason behind the vision, the Jews being harmed by them for lack of better words? Well, the reason for the vision, as you look here, is to reveal these things to Daniel. And it's interesting because we haven't even got to verse 27 yet. Look at verse 27. He says, and I, Daniel, fainted and was sick for days. Afterward I rose and went about the king's business, and I was astonished by the vision, but no one understood it. There's another time that we read about something like this back in, we looked at it yesterday, Daniel chapter 7 and verse 28. His thoughts greatly troubled him, and he kept the matter in his heart. This is God revealing, I would say, his activity, obviously, God's providential activity throughout the years, but also Daniel as a prophet being given these revelations to I guess what I would say is to see the outworking of God's plan throughout the years. Remember now, when you read this here in Daniel chapter 8, when Daniel, had seen the vision and was seeking the meaning, Daniel didn't understand it. And the New Testament tells us that too, that, again, 2 Peter 1, verses 10 through 12, that some of these things that those men saw, they didn't fully understand. And Peter even says there, things which even angels desire to look into. Daniel, and David says Daniel is a fantastic book, and it absolutely is, because of the specificity. And if we were to leave, if all we had was Daniel chapter 8 here, and the explanation here, where you have the kings of Persia, verse 20 mentioned, verse 21, the kingdom of Greece. If that's all you knew about this particular section of this vision, and then you could look at the records of secular history, it's pinpoint. It's so accurate. So a couple of books here that I've got. The Apocrypha talks about this. Now, the Apocrypha is not part of the inspired Word of God. I have a Catholic version of the Bible that includes this between Malachi and Matthew. This is not part of the inspired Word of God. It's not part of the canon. But is a valuable source for things like this, because it records events that took place in what we call, or during what we call, the intertestament period. And so if you want to read, if you have the Apocrypha, I don't know if you do or not, but if you want to read about Antiochus Epiphanes, you can go to the book of 1 Maccabees, chapter 1. Read 1 Maccabees, chapter 1, and you'll learn about what happened that Daniel was, I guess I would say, privileged to see this vision of. Another book that I have that talks about this is The Complete Works of Josephus. Josephus was a Jew. He was not a Christian, but he lived during the 1st century. I believe he was born in 37 A.D. But he's a historian. All right, he wrote a lot of this down. You can access this stuff. So part of this book here is called The Wars of the Jews, and in his book called The Wars of the Jews, it's book 1, chapter 1, verses 31 and 32. He writes about it, and writes about it very specifically, and it matches up with what was written in the Apocrypha in the intertestament period. So there are extra biblical sources out there, outside of the Bible, sources from outside of the Scriptures, that help us even more so understand visions like in Daniel chapter 8. And like I said, what he sees here in Daniel chapter 8 is going to come into play in Daniel chapter 11 with a lot more detail. But we'll talk about that when we get there. So hopefully that makes sense to you, Diana. Hope that I answered your question. It's God revealing himself, his activity, his will being accomplished throughout the years. And the prophets were able to see that. Okay, guys. I don't see any more comments or questions. A lot of greetings. Good to see everybody again today. If you have any questions or any comments about any of this, the comment section will still be available after the live stream is over. Like and share our videos if you would, please. Get this content out there. If you have somebody who'd like to do this kind of study that doesn't do Facebook, send them over to our YouTube channel. All of this content is uploaded there on YouTube at the Mammoth Spring Church of Christ. Appreciate y'all being here today, and we will come back tomorrow, and we're continuing the chronological look at Daniel, so we're going to jump from chapter 8 to chapter 5. And so hope you'll be back tomorrow, and everybody have a good day.